Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Thank you very much. So today I'm going to be talking about quite an interesting fly fishery in the Turks and Caicos Islands. It's a fairly new fishery, and a little bit about the work that we're doing over there with the Turks and Caicos Fly Fishing Association to try and promote the best access to the opportunities that the development of this fishery really provides. So for those of you that don't know, the Turks and Caicos Islands are a UK overseas territory located in the northeastern Atlantic and just south of the Bahamas. The islands have really revolved around the salt trade in their early history. Settlers began to produce and trade salt in the 1600s. There was a short era where plantation owners established themselves following the American Revolution, but it was largely unsuccessful, and the primary industry really transitioned to fisheries in the 1900s. First with the Queen Conch in the 1930s, which established an export market to neighboring countries in the Dominican Republic and Haiti, and later in the 1950s to Caribbean spiny lobster, which later became the primary target species, or at least the most economically important target species within the small-scale commercial sector. In terms of fisheries, unfortunately both the conch and lobster fisheries are deemed to be overexploited. A study in 2016, which did a catch reconstruction, identified major underreporting of queen conch across the fishery and regular overconsumption of the annual quota. A 2023 study, which used underwater visual surveys and video tows, deemed the population density to be well below what's considered to be viable for a spawning population. In terms of lobster, we've seen broad reductions in both the mean size and catch per unit effort throughout the years, although that has stabilized somewhat throughout the 2000s, and we think that this is due to deep water refuge and spillover from neighboring islands. However, the real economic, social, and cultural revolution in the Turks and Caicos Islands happened in the 1990s, and this was with the development of large-scale tourism and development, which radically transformed how the islands operate. So the Turks and Caicos Islands have now positioned themselves as one of the fastest growing tourism destinations in the world. With this immense growth, obviously come a lot of tourists. So over the last 30 years, the number of overnight visitors to the Turks and Caicos Islands rose dramatically from approximately 50,000 visitors in the 1990s to 750,000 visitors today. If you consider the cruise industry, which are typically 24-hour visitors to the islands of, or to the island of Grand Turk, that number is close to 2 million visitors per year. If we look at GDP, the economic productivity rose from about $350 million in the early 2000s to well over $1.7 billion today. And in order to cope with this huge growth, the population grew predominantly through the attraction of a skilled labor force. So you've got a lot of expats coming to the islands. We also have a lot of irregular migrants coming across from Haiti, escaping the socio-political issues that are happening over there. And the population grew steadily, but primarily on the main island of Providenciales, where you've got this tourism hotspot. If you look on the bottom left, you'll notice that belongers or Turks and Caicos Islanders now constitute just over a fifth of the population inside of their own country. In terms of the fishing communities, these were once the social and economic pillars of the community, but they've been left in the wake of this tourism development and are ultimately heavily marginalized. There are very few opportunities for them to integrate into the growing tourism sector, and this is particularly true on the sister islands away from Providenciales. The GDP, or the contribution to GDP of fisheries or commercial fisheries, dropped from about 10% in the 90s to less than 1% today, although the number of Turks and Caicos Islanders that rely on fishing remains around 10%. With the tourism revolution, you had the introduction of new types of activities. So primarily you had sport fishing, and in particular you had flats fishing and fly fishing. And I'm going to talk specifically about bonefish. So bonefish were discovered to be in good numbers and good sizes in the Turks and Caicos Islands several years ago, but there's been a progressive increase in the number of operators and people that are traveling to this country specifically to catch these animals. And there was a film produced at the International Fly Fishing Film Festival in 2024 that focused on this. So this begs the question, does this provide a golden opportunity? So we know that sport fishing can provide an alternative for fishing communities to access the high-value tourism market. This is particularly relevant in this case because we want to try and distribute some of that tourism revenue away from Providenciales and towards the sister islands where people can access it. It's also really important to note that Turks and Caicos Islanders are people that want to be on the water. They're boatsmen, they're captains. They align themselves as fishermen and they identify as fishermen. So this is something that aligns well with that. We know that catch and release fishing has the potential to be low impact and sustainable if it's done the right way. And it can drive a shift from consumptive artisanal fishing to recreational catch and release, and hopefully we can shift some of that pressure from the commercial fish stocks that are not doing particularly well at the moment. So just a ballpark to give you some perspective, based on an economic study that was done in the Bahamas by the Bonefish Tarpon Trust, 2019, we estimate roughly that the value of this fishery could quite quickly grow to about 2 to 4 million US dollars per year. And to put that in perspective, the value of the small-scale commercial fishery today is about 11 million US dollars per year. However, we know these ecotourism catch and release fisheries models are prone to failure, and there's several barriers. We know from work from these papers as well as many others. We have poor governance playing a role. If we don't have governance that protects the fisheries and the habitats that they rely on, there's a good chance that we're not going to succeed. We also need maximized benefits for local communities. You can't expect local communities to buy into the conservation of a species or a habitat that they're not benefiting from. And in order to do this, we need to really radically reduce economic leakage. There are also socio-cultural aspects at play. Skilled labor requirements. Are local people able to meet the requirements of the growing industry? Are there conflicts at play? Are there conflicts with other sectors? We also have ecological impacts. We know that catch and release fishing is not benign. We know that fish do die, and that can lead to overfishing, habitat degradation, and environmental change. And this is particularly relevant in a place like Turks and Caicos, where you have such a sensitive environment, but also such a small environment. So, to talk a little bit about our approach on the project, Seb spoke about this yesterday in his talk, getting stuck in this analysis loop and trying to have all the answers before taking action. And I think what this really focuses on is taking action now. The fishery is growing really quickly, and we need to do something. So we went to the UK government and applied for a grant to really focus on increasing capacity within the fishery, working on some basic policy, and overall getting everyone organized under the Turks and Caicos Fly Fishing Association, putting laws in place to protect the environment and the species, trying to limit leakages as far as possible through foreign investment, empowering local people, initiating research and data collection, and sharing and spreading the message. So a part of this was to develop a training program. We lent heavily on what's happened in the Bahamas, and we partnered with some Bahamian counterparts that have developed a program there. And the idea was to really produce a holistic guiding professional. And this would be someone who could safely operate and maintain vessels, deliver exceptional client experiences, grounded in Turks and Caicos culture, demonstrate global standards for safety, conservation, and customer care, serve as ambassadors of sustainable tourism and ocean stewardship, participate in data collection and management of the fishery, and foster a blue economy. In order to deliver this guide program, we partnered with the Turks and Caicos Islands Community College through their technical and vocational educational training program. And we are hoping to produce the first 6-week course in September this year, which will be offered on an annual basis to Turks and Caicos Islanders. Another element was to implement a tagging program. So part of the training is going to be equipping guides with tagging kits to initiate long-term data collection. This is not only going to allow us to start collecting some information, but it's going to promote angler participation and guide participation in the actual data collection and management of the fishery. We're going to foster data ownership amongst stakeholders, including the guides themselves, and hopefully through this develop a relationship between the management agency and the guides. The last part of the program is really a marketing and communication element, and this is kind of out of my wheelhouse. So we're leaning quite heavily on some marketing experts to really develop a messaging guide. So this is something that goes to guides and to stakeholders and educates them about how they should talk about their work, how they should talk about their waters, and why that matters, and how to communicate with guests effectively. There's also a marketing program that aims to position the Turks and Caicos as a world-class fly fishing destination that is producing world-class fish, but is also sustainable and giving back to the environment and developed with all the right things in place. So to finish off, I wanted to kind of take it back to that cart before the horse and getting stuck in the analysis loop. I think there's a lot of work that needs to happen. I've thrown this up, don't get lost in the detail. It's just to share the message that recreational fisheries are really complex social ecological systems with so many components. And we need to understand those all effectively if we're going to make informed decision making. But we don't want to let that stop us from making decisions. And as Steve said this morning, having an adaptive approach to management is really the way forward, in my opinion. So we have a few key questions that we would like to start with, and we're going to be going. Our president of the association had meetings with ministry yesterday, and we're really hoping to start with both a socioeconomic study as well as looking more at the cultural influence and the social-ecological information. Those are my references, and thank you very much. This project is funded through the Biodiversity Challenge Grant and the Darwin Plus. Yes, absolutely. There are other sectors, and there's also other types of fishing involved in the bonefish fishery. In particular, you have people fishing for them with other methods, and I think that's where I brought in that complexity, because I was chatting with Vivian yesterday, and the interesting thing is a lot of the guys involved in this fishery wear so many different hats. And as sport fishermen, when lobster season opens, they might be commercial fishermen for 2 weeks. Then they may become bonefish fishermen for a while. Then they may transition to wahoo fishermen during that season, and later maybe tuna. So there's so much overlap and these fuzzy boundaries, as she puts it, that it really complicates it. But to answer your question, absolutely, there are other sectors and other types of fishing. But we find that people involved in fishing are typically dipping their toe into multiple different types, although there are some specialist fly guides as well. Yeah, it's a great question, and it's something that we don't really have the answer to yet. There's a train of thought that says make it mandatory, make all guides have to get a permit, and in terms of getting the permit, they need to go through this training so that we know that everyone that's on the water is educated and aware and not going to go out and potentially be damaging the fishery. So that's one train of thought. The other one's to kind of market it at a different angle. There are quite a few studies that have shown that having a certification makes you more marketable or attractive as a guide in certain instances. So there's that element as well. Which way we're going to go, I'm not entirely sure.
Really, really interesting talk. I work in the tourism fly fishing industry in Seychelles, so obviously there's quite a lot of interest over there. There's always this talk of economic leakage, particularly with foreign-owned enterprises in this industry. I'm not sure how the industry works in Turks and Caicos, whether it's mostly lodge-based or whether you can hire a private guide and go out with them. But is there financial capacity to actually manage lodges in Turks and Caicos, within the Turks and Caicos community, in a way that would benefit the economy to reduce that economic leakage? Because in some cases, foreign investment is necessary and it actually increases the economic potential of the fishery.
Absolutely. Again, great question. And again, I'm not entirely sure what the answer is. So at the moment, the fishery is developing. I would say on the main island, most people are staying at resorts and hotels and Airbnbs, not dedicated fly fishing lodges. But we are starting to see some of the first lodges on some of the sister islands. And from what we can see, a lot of these are foreign investments. So it's someone that's come down there, enjoys fishing, they bought a house and they've set up a lodge and they offer packages for American tourists. So there's high rates of leakage if that's the way it continues to go. In terms of getting locals access to capital, there are some mechanisms through the tourism department. There's an organization called Invest TCI, which gives potentially interest-free or low-interest loans to people within certain sectors. So the commercial fishery has access to this mechanism, and we are trying our best to get recreational fishers to have access to this as well. So they can hopefully invest in boats, possibly accommodations, and really set themselves up to maximize the profits. Yeah.